Hi, this is Erin, and welcome to Everything EFL, my little podcast about English language teaching and other teachy stuff too. Credit and honourable mentions will be given during the episode or in the show notes. Let's crack on. Hi everyone, and welcome to Everything EFL. My guest today is an author, a trainer, a presenter, a methodologist, I stole that word from his website, a relentless campaigner of everything lexical and probably a lot more besides, to be honest. Here is Mr. Hugh Dellar. Welcome, Hugh.
Thank you very much. Hello. Thank you for inviting me onto the show.
Absolute pleasure. I'm delighted to talk to you. So let's start with just a very brief nutshell of your career thus far. What can you tell us?
Oh, God. So I, like a lot of native speakers, I guess, I stumbled into English language teaching by accident. I did an English literature degree, which didn't really seem to make me able to do much more than talk about Keats whilst sitting in pubs, which I was very good at for a period of my youth, before a mate of mine somehow managed to talk me into doing a CELTA course, or a C-TEFLA, as they were back then. I worked initially in London. I then went off and worked in Indonesia, came back to London, did a Delta, did an MAT Sol. By the time I finished my MAT Sol, my first book had come out, Innovations. And I'd moved from working in the private sector to working at University of Westminster, where I spent 18 years until they rewarded my loyal service with compulsory redundancy. Thank you very much. During that time, I got into course book writing in a kind of big way and became a teacher trainer. And eventually, once we were made redundant, my entire department, apart from the two non-union members, purely coincidentally, join a union, kids. My writing partner and I ended up setting up our own company, Lexical Lab, in 2014. And we've basically been self-employed since then and doing a mixture of writing teacher development courses, which we deliver online, running an online language school predominantly. We were running summer schools in London, but all that's kind of fallen by the wayside in this time of COVID. The last sort of 20 years as well, on the back of the writing, I've been doing quite a lot of presenting and conferences and that kind of thing. So that's basically me in a nutshell.
That takes care of the and much more besides part of my introduction. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's just dive in. So why don't you just start with what the lexical approach is versus the traditional run-of-the-mill sort of course book approach that most teachers would probably be doing?
Okay, so I guess the way I would look at it is that the lexical approach is primarily an approach to language. It's a way of thinking about and looking at language that sees grammar and words as more interdependent and more contextually dependent than maybe many of us are trained to think of them. On a very simple level, I think the traditional way of presenting language was primarily around kind of present, practice, and produce individual discrete grammatical structures.
Yes.
Often, you know, this idea that you have to master one structure before you can move on to the next structure. Mm-hmm. You can't see the structures interacting with each other generally. You know, we make weird little exceptions, like when you're doing the present perfect simple, you can also look at the past simple, but generally we don't look at how structures interact with each other. We certainly don't look at how that works within particular kinds of conversations. Generally, words have been presented in lexical sets, so you get, 10 kinds of vehicles, or at higher levels, 10 ways of walking, or 10 ways of laughing, or whatever.
10 phrasal verbs. That's always a popular one.
Phrasal verbs with get, that kind of thing, or with down as a preposition. And I guess a lexical way of looking at things is to see a lot of language, particularly spoken, but not exclusively language, as being more fixed, more prefabricated, more formulaic than maybe we'd often assumed. And just to recognize that there's a lot of things that we say and write which come as fixed blocks of language. So just this morning, I was chatting to one of my neighbours who, her son has got COVID at the moment quite badly, and she said he'd been lulled into a false sense of security because he's so fit. Okay. He's like this super fit marathon runner who's now got really bad COVID and he hasn't been vaccinated yet. And that whole chunk, lulled into a false sense of security, is very common. You know, if you Google it, you can see hundreds of thousands of examples of that. And there's not many other things you can be lulled into, and there's not many other things you can do to a false sense of security. So it's just recognizing that a lot of language operates like that, and thinking about what you actually say using the grammar and vocabulary that you're teaching, how grammar and other words interact with the words that you're teaching, and how words and other grammatical structures interact with the grammar that you're teaching, and bearing that in mind all the time when you're going into the classroom. I think it should be also stressed that this doesn't necessarily imply a particular approach to teaching. It's very much bringing this way of thinking about language into the classroom. And I think once you do have this way of thinking about language, it does impact on the kinds of things you prioritize or deprioritize in your own classroom. And it impacts over time on the kind of things you choose to spend time on, the kind of things you focus on, the way you explain things, the examples that you give, and I guess also the way you think about learning and progress and what's realistic in terms of measuring student attainment, all those kinds of areas, I think. So yeah, that would be the kind of condensed version.
That's the condensed version, right?
Yeah. I talk a lot, so you know, it's I could go on.
Yeah, I've listened to some of your presentations online, I know. Yeah, I think you've already answered this question in a way, but I was sort of going to ask you, like, if there's a certain structure to follow, or is it just a more organic process?
The basic answer is it depends on the way you interpret what a lexical approach is, I think. And I think with the guy who kind of popularized it, Michael Lewis, one of the problems he had was he never really worked out how you might think about syllabusing Lexis, and you might think about condensing it down into course books at different kinds of levels. So what he emphasized instead was a lot of attention to collocation, focusing more on multi-word chunks, kind of, you know, providing input-rich classroom environments. And I think that's all fine. In a way, if you're teaching in a kind of dogme-esque style, where you're working from what you're hearing students say and helping them to say things better, that can also involve quite a lexical way of looking at things, because you might hear your students try to say things and you might rephrase it. And the way that you rephrase it isn't by just changing a collocation or correcting a bit of grammar. It's basically saying, yeah, I know what you mean. The fact that you might have to quarantine for 10 days on your return puts a lot of people off going abroad. And maybe what the students actually said is, many people don't go different country this year, holidays, because on return, 10 days self-isolation.
Yeah.
And you know what you're doing is taking that kind of broken communication and re-grammering it and rewording it. I think in terms of how you might think about syllabusing it, I guess that then comes down to individual interpretation. For us, with what we've done with our own course books, with outcomes and with innovations, is to kind of start by thinking about, at this level with these students within this topic area, what might a realistic conversation for them to be able to have be? What might a kind of desirable communicative outcome for this hour be? What might we want students to be better at talking about by the end of this lesson than they are at the start of this lesson? And what language, in its kind of purest sense, grammar and vocabulary in combination, might they need to learn to help them have those conversations better?
Yeah.
So I guess the way I've kind of come to think about it is, well, what is it you want to talk about? what language do you think might be useful for students at this level?
Rather than by the end of this lesson, you will be able to use the present perfect.
Exactly,
Yeah,
which is, it's a comforting illusion to cling on to the idea that that might be how things work. But
certainly.
once you've been trying to do that for a couple of years, you realize acquiring full use of the present perfect doesn't occur in one lesson like that,
Or ever.
or ever, you know.
It's a minefield.
Yeah, yeah, to use a fixed phrase.
So what you were talking about with students, like say something and you reword it, is that what you
Yeah.
call emergent language?
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny idea, the emergent language thing, because in a way, a lot of what you're focusing on is language which doesn't quite emerge in a way. It's, and I always thought it was strange because you're dealing with emergent ideas
Yeah,
and you're rewording them.
that's a good
I
way to
know
put
that
it.
it's traditionally called emergent language in the classroom and in the literature, but I don't think it's a great word for it, because I guess what I'm always looking for is things that don't quite emerge but could or should, and making that available to students. And a lot of the time, it's often quite simple things. So it's like, if students don't know how to say something like, it's a second edition, they end up saying things like, is a book which is similar to old book, but this book has been updated and made more modern and changed with pictures. And you go, yeah, it's a second edition. And if you don't know that chunk or that
Yeah,
collocation, then you actually fall back on plan B, which is explaining in a long-winded way, using words and grammar and making up those sentences as you go along, and making more of what might be thought of as traditional grammar mistakes, because you don't know the
the
chunk,
chunk.
which allows you
Yeah.
to say it in a very condensed way.
Mm.
I guess it's forcing into being language which you decide expresses the ideas that have emerged from your students.
Yeah, which makes sense really. So I've seen you online doing this where you have a few sentences on the board and then you talk through the grammar. So you'd say something like, okay, why is this verb ing? It's because there's a
Yeah,
preposition. So you kind of do the grammatical stuff there as and when you do
yeah,
it. And then I suppose, is it just a matter of sort of recycling and trying to get students to keep using that in different ways?
yeah. So we've all got this knowledge which is provisional and developing, and I guess my feeling is, if you're focused primarily on communication and conversation and what you might do with the language that you're learning, it means that the core grammar you're going to need recurs over time.
It
So,
does.
every conversation you're going to have, you're going to need a bit of present perfect, simple and continuous, a bit of present simple, a bit, all of those things will be there and they'll appear. There'll be some passives, there'll be some going to, there'll be some will, there'll be some would. And often what you're doing is you're just kind of drawing attention to it. But I think it's that kind of idea, like, if a present perfect continuous pops up and you have something like, I've been toying with the idea for ages, but I'm still not sure I really wanted to go through with it. You might just check, yeah, what tense is it? Present perfect continuous. Why? Yeah, because for ages, thinking about it, thinking about it, thinking about it, thinking about it, still thinking about it, still not sure if I want to do it or not, still not sure if I want to go through with it. Good, just checking.
Yeah.
And you can choose to make that as explicit or as implicit as you want. Some classes where I know their grammar is weaker or they're a bit more grammar anxious because of their own kind of educational experiences, I'll forefront that stuff a bit more. Some classes where basically grammar's not their problem because they're quite high level already, I generally won't mention it. Words pattern differently from one language to another. That's often the issue that you want to draw attention to.
Yeah, and it kind of makes more sense because, there's like this fixed order that course books have for grammar,
Yeah,
but that's
yeah,
language doesn't follow that fixed order. I mean, if you think about like, what are you doing at the weekend? You can teach that at elementary. It's a
yeah,
perfect thing for conversation,
yeah,
or like, sorry, I'm late. My train was delayed,
yeah,
just little
absolutely.
stuff like that. And they need to know it.
And I think it's just teaching that early on without making a deal out of it and
Yeah.
just saying, Yeah, you know, what you do weekend in English, that's what you do. What are you doing this weekend? And you just teach it like that. And then maybe later, they do actually do half a lesson where they look at, you know, present continuous for future meaning. And they kind of go, that's like that thing we learned at beginner level.
Exactly. It's not new. It's not like this big
And that
new thing.
they've got a kind of foundation to build on
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah. So that makes perfect sense. Just coming back to emergent ideas, shall we call it?
Yeah.
So the only issue I can see with this is like you'd start collecting a lot of chunks of language that your students are throwing out and you're correcting. What's the best way to what's the best thing to do with all this language in terms of recycling?
Yeah. So I think there's 3 or 4 things to say about that. And I know it's something lots of teachers worry about. The first thing to say is I think we've all been kind of corrupted by this idea of present, practice, produce that still dominates course books, the kind of English file headway sort of model. And we bring this conditioning with us over into the way we think about vocabulary as well. And we kind of think that because I've presented it, I now have to get them to practice and produce it, and I must see it becoming part of their active vocabulary. It doesn't work like that, basically. And I think, I guess the first point to make would be you can't expect everyone in the class to remember and produce everything that you focus on during classroom time, okay? There will be some degree to which students self-select and just go, oh, that bit's great, that bit, bloody football, I'm not interested, I don't care, I'm going to ignore that bit.
True.
That's fine, you know, that's different. It's the same as when you're learning your first language. Different people acquire different areas of vocabulary because they're interested in different things and they've got different needs and social lives and hobbies and stuff.
Yeah, some
So
things naturally stick and some things don't.
yeah. And you know, what might stick for you might not be what sticks for me. And you just have to accept that. I think also it's thinking about just repeated encounters with things over time, okay? And rather than thinking about language learning as being like a kind of little Lego house where you're putting one block on after another and building up a big wall, I kind of have come to think about it as a bit more like a cement mixer where you're kind of chucking stuff in and you're turning the cement mixer around and it starts to stick in different places. And different bits will stick with different people, but you keep on churning the cement to make it stickier. And I guess in terms of what you then do with it, well, sometimes when you've got it up on the board, you might leave gaps in the sentences. You might paraphrase the ideas and try to elicit it. You might ask questions about that. So it might be something like, I don't know, what did I have this morning? Oh, yeah. If you're not careful, you end up paying through the nose for things, okay? And I just gapped nose. And so as we're going through, I said, okay, so I heard some of you say, if you're not careful, things can be very, very expensive. You know, you end up spending a fortune on things. You end up paying through anyone know? And someone sort of went, it's not arm and a leg, is it? It's like, no, it's not. It's the other one that basically means the same thing. You pay through that nose. Good. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
You can then ask, you know, what kind of things might you end up paying through the nose for if you're not careful? Okay. We had a little discussion about that. So already you've kind of done 2 things with it in the moment that you're going through it in the classroom. What you might then do is they might make Quizlet cards. They might have L1, L2 versions of that expression, or they might just have gapped sentences, which they test themselves on. You might do some revision next lesson where you just give some sentences and you gap. Maybe you gap the preposition. You know, he didn't do any online price comparison, so he ended up paying the nose for it.
That's a good idea because prepositions are always a nightmare, aren't they?
And it keeps students on their toes because it's kind
Yeah.
of like, oh, I wasn't expecting to be tested on that different test. It's like, yeah. Maybe what you then do is in your own teacher talk, you might recycle it. You might be telling a story saying, yeah, I'm planning to take most of August off. I'd love to go abroad, but I can't. You know, I'm just going to be holidaying in England this year. But one of the things I'm worried about is, you know, they've hiked up all the prices because lots of people are sort of vacationing in England, And, I don't want to pay through the nose for things. And you might just use it yourself at another point. And then after that, you let it go, because you can't revise everything all the time forever.
No.
Um, and if students want that one, they'll remember it. Some of them might use it actively. Some of them, it'll just sit in the back of their head. And maybe in a year's time, they'll be watching a movie or reading something and they'll kind of go, bing, oh, I remember that.
Yeah.
And some of them will forget it,
And the
and I think it's just accepting that.
yeah, no, that's great. And I think the thing with all those really common sort of phrases is they will come up again and again if the students are
Exactly.
looking and reading and stuff. Just quickly going back to Quizlet, just in case anybody
Yeah.
listening doesn't use it. So it's basically an app where students can make their own flashcards. Is that right?
Yeah. Or you can make flashcards and share them with your students, however you want to do it.
Okay. And then they can sort of test themselves. They have little activities on there where they can test themselves.
Exactly. Yeah.
Brilliant.
The other one that I do a lot with low levels is sound files of bilingual things. And again, students can make their own versions if you don't speak the student's first language.
For translation.
Basically,
And
it's
yeah.
just translating the chunks in and out of the language. And it's very language focused and very satisfying, because you do have a sense of progress in a way that you don't always get when you're learning new skills, I think. Because you kind of go back and you go, well, okay, so I've got 500 items on my little bilingual list, and I know all those ones now. I can remember them. So, that's 500 more than I knew a year ago.
Okay. But emphasis being on chunks rather than words.
Yeah, 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 yeah. What's your name? What's his name?
Yeah.
What does he do? What does she do? He's a doctor. She's a journalist. And learning the whole thing together like that.
Yeah. So, what positive effects are you likely to see in class when you take a more lexical approach, do you think?
So I think there's 3 or 4 things that start to change. One is students ask more interesting questions, okay? And you no longer have those kind of mad, what's the difference between could, may, must, might, will, should, and shall? And it's like, oh, just kill me now. You don't get those kind of questions. I mean, instead, what you get is, so what's the difference between injury and wound? Okay. What's the difference between oily and greasy? And those are interesting, those kind of questions, because you often can't explain them just through definitions. You have to think about what you do with those words, what the examples are. You get more stories coming into the class because, by definition, explaining a lot of things involves having to tell a little story that contextualizes it. And in order to explain those things, a lot of the time, you draw on stories, things that have happened in class, things you know about your students, things that you know the students know about in the wider world. And so it kind of connects the classroom to the world in lots of different ways. I think you also just see students become a bit more comfortable and confident in speaking a bit more normally and a bit more naturally. They're not so obsessed about whether or not they're making grammatical slip-ups, because they recognize that you're not listening to them, waiting to jump on their next grammar error. You're basically listening to them and trying to communicate with them and have a conversation with them. And while you're doing that, you're helping them to say the things they want to say better. And
Yeah.
that's a very different kind of psychological orientation to development and progress. Because I think in the old days, I was always very guilty of, I was one of those teachers that would be sitting there kind of waiting for you to slip up. And, all you do in those situations is you just breed grammar anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're scared to talk because they
Yeah,
don't want to make
yeah, yeah, yeah.
mistakes.
And as you would be, because, who wants to talk to someone who's basically not listening to what they're saying, but listening to how they're saying it?
Yeah, and I think you're right, because I mean, like at the course that I'm doing, I'm sort of 3 weeks in an EAP course, and I asked the students what they wanted to sort of achieve by the end of it, and or what they wanted to do. And one of them said more grammar. We haven't looked at anything explicitly grammatical, but we have been focusing on loads of collocations, loads of
Yeah,
lexical chunks, loads of phrases. And that particular student hasn't said anything since about grammar,
yeah, yeah,
because I think they're just happy with the way that they're looking at language. They're looking at it in a way they've never looked at it before.
yeah. And I think actually students will often say they want more grammar because that's the kind of default way in which students express the idea of being dissatisfied with their own language.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's like, still struggling with English. What do you need? Well, it's a rare student who will say, I need to broaden my lexicon. Because I mean, like, how are they supposed to know about that? So
Yeah.
the way that people generally think about progress and competence in a language is to do with developing accuracy and broadening what you can do with your grammar.
Mm.
And I think actually a lot of those students, like you said, who say they want more grammar, really what they mean is, I want to be better able to say what I want to say.
Yeah, exactly.
And when you look at the grammar, okay, I mean, if you're writing academic stuff, sure, there's specific kinds of grammar that are often subject specific or genre specific, where you need to look at particular kinds of grammatical things that are going on. But, you know, you listen to like a lecture, a heavy duty academic lecture. You know, I did a course last year when the pandemic started. I did a Yale University had an online open access course on the history of pandemics. And I watched 21-hour videos about the history of pandemics, which was fascinating. Thank you, Yale. Grammatically, I mean, it was almost all just like past simple,
Yeah.
past simple, present simple. I mean, the grammar was so not the issue. You know, the issue
Yeah.
was just this insane amount of vocabulary and like getting my head around all the concepts and I think a lot of the time, a lot of what is actually very advanced level English is grammatically quite simple. So I think it's just recognizing that a lot of the time that's really not the issue. When students are reading around their subjects, it's never going to be the grammar, almost never going to be the grammar that stops them understanding. It's going to be the
Yeah.
fact they don't understand the core vocabulary.
Exactly. The only grammar I've touched on is that if we're looking through a transcript or something, maybe just highlight the passive verbs and then
Yeah,
the
exactly.
students to stick them on a list, because
Yeah,
the same verbs tend to, and I said to them, if you see it more than once, start marking it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and see which ones come up more, because
yeah,
most verbs that are passive are usually passive.
yeah. And some will almost exclusively be
Yeah,
passive, you know, like
exactly.
earmark or something like that.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, it's been
absolutely.
earmarked for, yeah. And often even with certain tenses,
Yeah, my flight was delayed.
exactly, you
Yeah,
know, was born being the classic example.
absolutely. Um, Here's a question. Are there any disadvantages or drawbacks to this approach that you've come across?
So I think there's 3 or 4 things to say in response to that. I guess like anything with teaching, there's a considerable degree to which the teacher has to buy into it first in order to ensure student buy-in. And if the teacher is ambivalent about it or finding it difficult, that's obviously going to become apparent to students. If the teacher is also in the process of, you know, kind of transitioning, if you like, from with a group of students who they've been teaching for a while, and they're transitioning from a more grammar dominated way of doing things to a more lexical way of doing things, there may be a degree of students feeling it's just all too much, and that, you know, things were easier, life was easier when they just had a tick box of which pages of Murphy's English grammar in use they've done already,
Yeah.
which ones they're doing next, and which 10 words from that lesson they're supposed to try and remember. And now they're overwhelmed with all of this new stuff, and how the hell are they ever going to produce it all? You may get students sometimes who want explanations for things that you just don't have explanations for. Okay.
Those questions come up anyway. They're
I
always
mean, they
going to
do come
have
up anyway.
a question that you're just going to say, because that's the answer. Don't analyze it. Like if a teacher is sort of getting a bit frustrated with the normal grammar plus words plus skills sort of course book approach, or the
Yeah.
PPP approach, and they want to start switching to a more lexical methodology, what kind of initial steps can they take to sort of dip their toes in the water?
I do think there are things you can do with whatever book you're teaching in a way. Okay. And, just take something like English file, which for me is the kind of antithesis of outcomes. It's like a kind of photographic negative version of it. Even with something like English file, you can still think about language in a lexical way. So one of the things I've always hated with English file is I think they treat vocabulary in a very cursory manner. They basically just gloss over the meaning and very rarely do much else with it. They're not that interested in how the vocab's used or example sentences or how it interacts with words or with grammar.
Yeah, they
So
tend
you
to
often get,
highlight single words, don't they, in
yeah,
texts?
so
Yeah.
you'll get 8 single words from a text and you match them to meanings,
Yeah.
or you'll get a little lexical set where you label parts of a car or something. And, fine, that does the bare minimum, okay? I know that some teachers feel comfortable with that because it doesn't require anything of them. But the reason it doesn't require anything of them is because it's not really teaching anything and there's not much meat there. So if you're doing something like that, I think you can still approach it in a kind of lexical way by thinking, well, okay, when I'm going through the answers to these parts of a car, which 4 parts of the car do I talk about most? What might I say about them? How can I get to those examples? So it might be something like, okay, and number 5, yeah, it's a windscreen, okay? And what might happen to your windscreen? What kind of problems might you have with your windscreen? Yeah, so maybe when you're driving, a stone might fly up from the road and either crack your windscreen or shatter your windscreen. And then you might write an example on the board saying, a stone flew up on the motorway and shattered our windscreen. So we had to. And then you ask the students, so what do you have to do if your windscreen shattered? Yeah, so we had to pull over to the side of the road and call the local garage. They came out and replaced it. Okay. And it might just be doing a bit more of that kind of thing with what's there. Yeah. You might decide you wanted to focus on, I don't know, seat belt. Yeah, well, when do you talk about seat belts? You might just say, is your seat belt on?
Yeah.
Okay, or have you got your seat belt on if you've got kids in the back of the car? Or you might say something like, he crashed, he went off the road and crashed into a tree. Luckily, he was wearing a seat belt. Otherwise, he might have died. He could have died. And you might just write that. And you might ask the student. So yeah, when might you say, luckily he was wearing a seatbelt? Yeah, okay. Yeah, what do you call that? Yeah, crash. Crash where? Into what? Tree. Yeah, okay. So, and you just kind of, you work with the students and you kind of, you word and grammar those little examples as you're going through what would otherwise just be something where students can stand there and look at a car and kind of say, seatbelt, windscreen. And you go, great, you're like a sort of weird human naming machine who can't actually talk English, but you can point at things and tell me what they are.
Yeah, that's such a good point when you're looking at that vocabulary bank kind of that list kind of formula.
What are you
It
going to
doesn't.
do with all this
Yeah,
stuff? What's it
exactly.
for? What are you
Yeah.
going to say with it? And
Mm.
it might just be, if you want to ease yourself into doing that kind of thing, look at the exercise. Say you've got 10 bits of a car you're labeling. Well, pick 3 that you wanted to do something with and think about what examples you're going to put up and what you might say or ask or do with those examples. And it might just be, all you do is you might kind of say, right, picture number 6. Yeah, it's the boot. Okay. So you might say, for example, and while the students were doing the exercise, you might have written on the board, just stick it in the boot of the car. Okay, that's it. That's all you have. Maybe you just have that. That's still much better than boot.
Boot, yeah. And it's
Yeah.
it's such a nice little phrase because that's pretty much or it's in the boot.
Yeah. Or, if you teach stick,
Yeah.
you can then recycle stick because, when
Yeah.
you're doing the little vocab thing of things in the kitchen, you can say, where should I put this? Just stick it in the cupboard. Just stick it in the sink.
Love it.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings me to the next point. I think you've kind of covered it a little bit, but sort of like you've got like sentence level kind of stuff there. Like you've got the chunks within a sentence, and then the next idea is to sort of put more text around it, isn't it? So your
Yeah.
students can produce like little dialogues and things like that using the language, which is a nice way of recycling. And then of course you can bring in pronunciation and intonation and stuff like that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it took me quite a long time to get to that. So when I first read the lexical approach and implementing the lexical approach, the thing that I think stuck with me most was the idea of collocation. So I started thinking about things like, oh, heavy rain, oh, deep snow. Oh, okay. Well, that's great. But then you just become a slightly more sophisticated human naming machine who stands at the window and points out and says, like, you know, strong wind. And you go, I know, mate, isn't it just? Yeah. It's then thinking, well, what are you going to say about heavy traffic or heavy rain or deep snow? Like, why are you talking about this? What's the context? What's the conversation? So it's then thinking, well, okay, it's quite nice at the moment, but they're predicting heavy rain for the weekend. Okay, who are you talking to? Why are you saying this? Okay, it's on Zoom, and I'm talking to my student in Samara, and she's telling me we're having a crazy heat wave here. It reached 40 yesterday. What's the weather like your end? Okay, or what's the weather like in London? Oh, it's quite nice at the moment, but they're predicting heavy rain for the weekend. Okay, so as soon as you start thinking more about, yeah, but what do you do with these words? What are they for? What do people say with them? What might you say using deep snow? Why are you talking about deep snow? What's the story? What's the context? What's the conversation? And once you start going down that road, automatically you start thinking in a more kind of lexical way, because you're thinking, well, what's the little mini conversation here? What's the exchange? Who's saying what to who and why?
Yeah, context is
Context,
so
context.
important in language learning. It really is, and the more you can bring it in, the better.
And it's so tricky. I mean, you know, you'll have seen it yourself as students slowly start learning to use both grammar and vocabulary. So much of it is to do with, yeah, I kind of know what you mean, but we don't use it in quite that way. Okay. And you've kind of got the meaning right, but it doesn't work in that kind of context. It only works in this kind of context.
Do you feel like you've sort of been banging on about this for a big, like a big while now? Like, what sort of what mindset are you up against in your mind?
Yeah, years ago, I did a talk once, and Michael Swan was there, who was a lovely, well, still is a lovely man. But I loved his writing and I loved his talks. And he came up to me at the end and basically went, "I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that. Keep fighting the good fight and keep saying what you're saying, because the buggers don't listen." And that kind of has stuck with me a lot, which is this idea that you basically need to work out 40 different ways of saying something quite similar, because change is slow. But then I think what you're up against is a fairly entrenched dominance of a particular way of looking at and thinking about and disseminating language, which is still that kind of grammar plus words way of doing things that's at the heart of English File, for example. I mean, obviously, English File doesn't only do that, and there are other things in there which are kind of closer to where I'm coming from. But that kind of way of thinking about language teaching is basically about unpacking and doing PPP-based lessons around grammar structures and teaching lexical sets which students can use to drop into those grammar structures. It's still quite dominant because publishers are still flogging books on the back of it. A lot of state exams are still very much focused on grammar, the use of grammar. It's easier to focus on, you know, can students choose the correct form of the verb than deciding which bits of vocab you expect them to know. It's kind of easier to get some sense of, oh, well, he can't use a third conditional than, you know, he's got a limited range of vocabulary for talking about things that happened to him in the past. So I think you've got all of that. You've also still got, and I think it's a big problem, things like Delta, where things like lexical approach lessons or even dogma lessons are seen as experimental practice. And it's like, well, what are you doing the rest of the time? What's the if you're saying your lexical approach lesson is your experimental lesson, by definition, that means the default approach is a non-lexical way of thinking about language, which is what, grammar plus words again, is it? Is that what you're supposed to be doing?
Mm.
And so I think things take a long time to change. Over the last 10, 12 years, I think there's been a definite shift towards this way of thinking. And I think that's been influenced to quite a large degree by the Common European Framework and that idea of teaching towards communicative competencies, and that way of defining competence, not in terms of your knowledge of grammatical structures or your ability to use grammar accurately across a whole wide range of topics, but your ability to describe holiday experiences or deal with problems in hotels, or, you know, when you're framing it in that kind of way, you're thinking about using grammar and lexis in limited kind of contexts, which are easier to define, easier to delineate, easier to syllabus, and easier to test. So I think the CEFRs had a huge effect. I think you're also starting to get things just kind of reach critical mass in a way. So you have enough people who've heard me or Andrew banging on about all this for 20 years. And in the end, people write their own books. So you have people like Leo Sullivan, who's kind of, you know, good 15 years younger than me, doing his kind of lexical grammar book. You have other people starting to do their own kind of how to teach lexically courses. And so I think you do have this kind of snowball effect of people who've been influenced by you influencing other people, and that starts to kind of slowly bring about some sort of systemic change. But I'm under no illusions that that's a small section of the global market, and
Yeah.
that, you know, in a way, actually, tech also has kind of exacerbated the problem, because so much of tech is geared towards basically kind of matching words to pictures, or single word kind of flashcard things, or, you know, look at a picture and say journalist, good, well done, and you know, little carrot, badge, and so I think that's easy to do in tech terms. It's harder to use tech to do something cleverer, or more clever,
More
or
chunky.
cleverer.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of a safety net, isn't it? The traditional approach, like
Yeah,
students, everybody
low
likes
stakes,
structure.
low risk,
Yeah,
low threat.
yeah, everybody likes structure. Schools need really to say, okay, this is our syllabus. This is what you're going to learn, in inverted commas,
Yeah,
by the end of the week. These are the so-called outcomes. And so it's just kind of, it's safer, isn't it? It's just
yeah,
safer,
yeah, 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 yeah,
and
yeah, yeah,
people get comfortable. People, it's
yeah.
like I was saying to my students yesterday, change is scary. It takes time.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, no one likes change.
But like, do you think there room for the traditional grammar approach?
Way too much room at the moment, I would say, personally.
Let me
I mean, you know,
rephrase. Should we just do away with it?
I mean, I would like to see us do away with it personally, which doesn't mean don't teach grammar. Okay. I mean, if you look at the course books we've written, all the grammar that you'd expect to see in other books appears in there. I think what's different is we frame it in a different kind of way. So we basically subjugate it to the greater communicative context, and we make it work within particular contexts rather than deriving random communicative contexts from the grammar. So I think what a lot of course books do is, here's the second conditional. Your speaking practice must only involve the second conditional, and it must involve lots of practice of the second conditional. So we'll do something mad, like have an insane conversation about what would you do if you won the lottery? Where would you buy your house?
Oh, the
How
classic.
many rooms would it have? What
Yeah.
kind of car would you buy with your £1 million? What would you do if you crashed your gold-plated Lamborghini?
Yeah. Instead of like, I wouldn't do that if I were you.
Exactly. Instead of looking at it a little bit in the context of another kind of conversation. So it might just be, you know, you look a little bit at, you maybe don't even call it second conditional. You maybe just call it, giving advice.
Yeah.
Okay. And it might just be, if I were you, I'd, or I wouldn't if I were you. And it might just be someone trying to get recommendations for something to do in a town. Okay. Like, you know, I'm thinking of going to Edmonton. I've heard there's some really great clubs up there. Oh, I'd be careful if I were you up there. It can get a bit hairy up there at night if you're not from the area. You know, you might just want to look at it in those kind of contexts, and in the knowledge that that's not everything they're ever going to need to do with the second conditional. So it's not that I don't think we need to look at things like the existence of the second conditional or the existence of passives. I just think we can teach them better, actually, than the way in which they're traditionally taught in most traditional grammar books. And I think I've spent way too much time in my teaching career teaching grammar really badly by doing things like, you know, what am I doing? What am I doing? You're playing the guitar. Good. What am I doing? You're riding a horse. Good. And I used to think, wow, I'm eliciting correct production of the present continuous. Now I just think, when's anyone going to look at someone and say, you're riding a horse? It's like, I know, I'm on it, you idiot. So it's not that I'm opposed to grammar teaching. It's just that teach it better and think about what it's for. And don't make all the communication solely about exclusive practice of one structure. Think about how it embeds itself within particular kinds of contexts. So, you know, I would like to see the current status quo disrupted and challenged a lot more, but that doesn't mean no grammar. I would say it means grammar better, actually.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've raised so many interesting and valid points, and I'm very grateful for your time.
You're welcome. Thanks, Erin. Thanks for your patience and your dedication, and for what you're doing for the industry. It's great.
Thank you very much. If you enjoyed this episode, hit that subscribe button. Follow me on Everything EFL on Facebook. If you do that, then I can invite you to my Everything EFL teacher development page, or you can follow me on Instagram at Everything EFL Pod. I'm posting videos most days with little teaching tips for you. Please see the show notes for all of my contact details. Also, you could write me a kind-worded review on iTunes or Spotify, or give me 5 stars to help push me up the ratings. The best thing you can do, though, is share this episode with a colleague. Share the love. Bye.